Dr. Ashish Nabar from IHRS. We have taken this initiative in the IHRS thanks to the initial, this program was conceived by Dr. Yash Lokhandwala and did a couple of times in Mumbai through the LTMGH Sion Hospital. And then in the EC meeting, they had this idea that why benefit the whole cardiology postgraduates from the country. Obviously, all of them have big opportunities to learn all aspects of cardiology in their department. But this is an elite group of IHRS, which is focused into EP and heart failure teaching and learning. And while the meeting happens once a year, in the last times we have realized that these meetings, of course, also bring a lot of learning. So I do not want to spend much time. We will have this once a month on the first 10 to 11:30. So very limited and very meeting. And we will request each different prominent department from the country who have an active EP program to do the program. So this time it is Dr. Aditya Kapoor's department from Lucknow, from Sanjay Gandhi Institute of Postgraduate and Medical Sciences. And they have planned a beautiful set of talks, and I will be handing over to Dr. Sudeep Kumar, professor of cardiology there, to conduct the proceedings here on. Sudeep, floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ashish, and welcome to the city of Nawab, although it's a virtual welcome. And from SGPGI Lucknow, we welcome all of you to this this academic extravaganza. As Dr. Ashish has already told us that it is conceived by HRS to make DM, and it is basically meant for the DM and DNB students to make them interested and take career in the electrophysiology and arrhythmia management. So that is the basic motto, and under the leadership of Dr. Yash, Dr. Ulas, and Vanita, this program is conceived, and Dr. Ashish Nabar is coordinator. So we have 3 cases, and to moderate these 3 cases, we have a very learned electrophysiologist and leading figure of the electrophysiologist from the country, Dr. Ajay Nayak, and Dr. Karthikeyan. So then we have 3 cases, and there is a little change in the sequence of presentation. Dr. Anindya Ghosh will be presenting first because he has to present his thesis for the award session in the CSI. And after that, Dr. C.V. Pandey and the third case will be done by Dr. Smarak. So let's start. And Dr. Adit, will you say something? Dr. Adit is my senior and learned guru, and he has selected these 3 cases and helped them in preparation of this presentation.
Thanks, Sudeep. I'll just conclude at the end only. So thanks, Ashish, for giving us this platform. Thanks, Ajay. Thanks, Karthikeyan. So
it's a pleasure.
Ajay,
please go ahead.
Yeah. So Ashish sort of planned this program, and he gave us a direction. So Anindya will be presenting first an EP case, and then C.V. Pandey will be presenting something about cardioversion, and then a PVC-induced cardiomyopathy, just a review. So thanks, Ashish, once again. So we'll get on.
It's a pleasure.
Anindya?
Yeah, I'll request everybody to mute their mics, and we'll let the faculty and Dr. Lokhandwala and myself be on so that we have less disturbance through the program. We can start. Thanks.
Anindya, can you start? So Anindya is the final DM student, so he has shown some interest in electrophysiology, so he presented. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. At the outset, I would like to express my sincere thanks for having given me opportunity to present a case in this virtual arrhythmia meet today. My case, sir, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. Go ahead.
My case is that of a 35-year-old male with recurrent palpitations for the last 2 years and being treated with extended formulation of diltiazem 90 mg twice a day, and with no family history of sudden cardiac death or any cardiovascular comorbidities. His echocardiographic parameters were also normal. This is his baseline ECG, showing a normal sinus rhythm with no obvious delta waves and only a PAC seen in the second beat.
ठीक है, अभी वाला स्मूथ ही चल रहा है.
Anindya, just 1 minute. Dheeraj, can you mute everybody except Anindya? That would be better. Yeah, Anindya, carry on, please.
This is the ECG of the tachycardia of that patient. This is a narrow complex regular tachycardia with a heart rate of approximately 170 to 180 per minute with a short RP interval, leaving us with the differentials of a typical AV NRT, an orthodromic AV RT, and an atrial tachycardia with a prolonged PR. We subjected the patient to an electrophysiology study, and the ventricular pacing from the RV apex shows in this tracing a decremental VA conduction. We can see this is the pacing spike followed by the paced QRS, which is being conducted retrogradely to the A's in CS tracings, and the VA interval, which we can see in CS 5-6. This is the VA, this is the VA, and this is the VA. The VA is getting prolonged with the ventricular pacing with the premature ventricular pacing at the third paced spike. Now, with V pacing, along with the VA decremental conduction, we were able to induce the tachycardia with the VAV response. The pacing spike led to a paced QRS complex which went into A and then again traversed to the T and perpetuated the tachycardia. This is the intracardiacs of the tachycardia showing a long VA interval that is more than 70 milliseconds, thus leaving us with the same differentials of a typical AV NRT, orthodromic AV RT, and atrial tachycardia. Now there are several maneuvers which are available to distinguish between these three. This is the tachycardia of the sleep patient.
If I may interrupt at this point, generally it's appropriate at this point of time to show the catheter position on fluoroscopy, because you have a RF catheter also, and we don't know where it is placed at the moment.
His catheter is in the RV actually, sir.
Yeah. So whether it's in the parahysient region, RVOT, you've stimulated from the RV apex, or is it from the mid RV region?
So RV apex only.
Okay. And
his catheter is in RV. The RF catheter is in the parahysient region, and the CS catheter in its usual location.
Okay. And just one more point. Whenever you're getting this concentric activation in the coronary sinus and the VA is slightly longer, it's not a long VA tachycardia, VA is shorter than AV, but whenever you get it, it's a good idea to have additional catheter in the right atrium or RA free wall to make sure you get some electrograms on the right side also. So you don't miss out on a shorter VA which is present on the right side of right atrial axillary pathway or something. Okay, go ahead.
So in this,
I think that's Anindya, that's a very good point which Sir has made. So we should have shown the intracardiac catheter positions here, which I think that slide is missing. And having a right atrial electrogram, I think these are great points for students who are listening, because the right atrial electrogram may be shorter than this. So that's
I have the final catheter positions, which I will show later in the slides.
See, when you have Dr. Aditya Kapoor standing behind you, it doesn't matter when you do the EP study with 3 catheters. He knows instinctively what is happening. But when he is outside, then you have to have everything in your hand, and you should be able to, you should not get confused during the EP study. So
these are two very important learning points for all of us. Yeah, go ahead.
In this intracardiac tracing of the tachycardia, apart from the long VA, we can see one of the V's leading to A's with a different type of conduction in which CS12 is earlier than the others. This is probably a APC from the left side, which has blocked the A which was about to come with this retrograde activation from this V. As we can see, the V is getting conducted retrogradely in all other beats with CS910 having the first A, but here the APC has blocked that retrograde conduction which is coming from the left.
I think this was Anindya, go back. This was what we had thought it is happening last night when we were seeing. So even we were a bit surprised. Ajay, you can maybe come back, or Ashish or Yash or Karthikeyan. What has happened here? We were sort of a bit foxed by it. What has happened? So we thought maybe it's a atrial premature beat which has come before the pathway could conduct retrogradely. So it was a bit funny.
So this was a one-off phenomenon, or
one-off? I think it was a one-off phenomenon, because otherwise we can think that there is another pathway which is left free wall or something. But
yeah,
the EP traces should be explained simply with. Dr. Yash has written that EP traces should be explained simply with channels, paper speed explained. So Anindya explained the channel speed also. That's a good point.
It's 150 millimeter per second.
Even the catheter was deep inside the CS catheter was. That is also a matter. So sometimes it is a tip can induce some.
So Anindya, what Dr. Karthikeyan is saying is this phenomenon that you saw, that what could be a left-sided PAC, it could be the coronary sinus catheter which is causing irritation and causing the PAC. So that is one possibility. So where the catheter position is, that matters.
Yes, obviously.
So many times this PAC is from the distal tip of the CS catheter, and that is very likely that this is happening here. Sure. Anindya, please continue.
So should I continue?
Yes, please go ahead.
This is the spontaneous tachycardia termination with an A. This indicates that the tachycardia is dependent on the AV node, and thus it rules out, is dependent on the AV node for its perpetuation, and thus it rules out an atrial tachycardia. Thus we are left with the differentials of typical AVNRT and orthodromic AVRT.
I think this statement should be clarified, either Karthikeyan or Ajay, please.
Anindya, sorry, Dr. Yash has written that please point out the A at the termination. So please point out the A at the termination.
So this is the A at the termination.
Maybe I think Ashish was saying something. I'm sorry I interrupted.
Yeah, sure. The tachycardia terminates with A. That should be clarified a little bit. Terminates with A. Atrial tachycardia usually won't terminate with the A. The last A would conduct. So when it terminates with the A, you can rule out an atrial tachycardia. This should be a general knowledge amongst everybody once you show this. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Dr.
Yes.
See, a lot. This program is basically meant mainly for the postgraduates. So many of them who are not from EP centers will not even be familiar with the screen. So therefore, please go slow, maybe few traces, but explain the screen and make this point which Ashish was saying for this, that when a supraventricular tachycardia terminates after a P wave, the A wave corresponds to the P wave. That means it terminates in the AV node. So if supraventricular tachycardia terminates in the AV node, it is very, very unlikely to be atrial tachycardia, because the last beat of atrial tachycardia also will go down the AV node. And therefore, this is not an atrial tachycardia.
So Anindya, please go slow and try to explain screen pe kya dikh raha hai, because people are writing that you should slightly go slow, and it terminates with a, jaisa Yash ne bola sir ne, it terminates with a P wave, indicates it's blocking in the AV node.
So again, for everybody to understand, it would be too much of a coincidence that tachycardia would terminate in the atrium and simultaneously block in the AV node. So since it terminates with an atrial electrogram with a P wave, that means it's blocked in the AV node. So it's a AV node dependent mechanism of arrhythmia. It's very unlikely that it would be a atrial tachycardia which terminates in the A and also blocks the AV node. That is not going to happen.
So if this is also important when you terminate the tachycardias in your EMS use, that you keep a running ECG so that you can see how it terminates, whether it terminates with a P or a QRS. Yeah, Anindya, please go on.
Yes. So with the atrial tachycardia being reasonably ruled out, we were left with the other two differentials. Then we encountered a spontaneous tachycardia initiation with the premature A. This is the sinus rhythm with first the P wave, which is seen in the CS catheters as this A, prominent A signals, followed by a V. This is the another sinus rhythm signal with an A and then a QRS with a V. I would like to remind everyone that his catheter is in the RV. So this is AV of a sinus rhythm. This is a premature atrial complex, probably from the left side because of a possibly deeply seated CS catheter, as already mentioned. This conducts to the V and then again perpetuates the tachycardia.
So Anindya, for the benefit of everybody, this third complex which you put a red arrow, why do you call it a PAC? You'll have to explain the activation sequence in the coronary sinus catheter.
So the normal activation sequence is from a high right atrium to the CS os and towards the left side. Our catheter, CS catheter, is numbered from proximal to distal, from distal to the proximal end, from CS 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, 10, such that the CS 9, 10 is towards the left, CS 1, 2 is towards the left side, and CS 9, 10 is towards the right side. So this is a normal atrial activation as seen from the CS catheters. We don't have the RA catheters. So this is a normal atrial activation. This is again a normal atrial activation with right-sided electrodes showing the earlier signal. However,
so I'll make a small point here for benefit of everybody. When Anindya says right side, it is basically coronary sinus ostium. It's in the midline of the heart, not the right side of the heart. It's the midline. It's in the coronary sinus ostium region. So the activation of coronary sinus is from proximal to distal, from CS 910 to CS 12 in the sinus rhythm. And in the third complex, Anindya will point out what happens.
So in the third complex, the activation is from the tip of the CS catheter, that is distally, from the left-sided location to a more towards the CS os. So it's the origin is of this A wave is from the left side, contrary to the prior two beats. So this is an APC. We can also see from the surface ECG of the same instance that this is a normally conducting sinus P wave, upright P, which is conducted to the QRS. And this is the APC, which inverted configurations in 2, 3 AVF and an upright configuration in AVR. So this is an APC which is starting the tachycardia.
Good.
So what was the baseline AH interval? What happens here during the his catheter during the PAC? Can you highlight that? What was the baseline AH interval when you started the EP study first?
So baseline AH interval is normal actually.
Okay. Did you measure the AH interval in the beginning of the first beat or that premature beats which you said now?
So I don't remember the exact measurements.
Okay.
But Dr. Karthikeyan, jo Anindya पूछ रहे हैं, in the premature APC, you have the RF proximal. You can see the RF proximal, RF distal in the his, no? So you can see the
it is in the
AH interval, and you see the next AH interval. So that is what sir is asking you.
Sorry, can I make a point?
Yes, sir.
I don't know if it was mentioned because I was away for half a minute. But important thing for the postgraduates to note is that the supraventricular tachycardia starts with a normal PR interval. So that is the first thing which they should note from the ECG. Always before looking at the intracardiac traces, please look at the surface ECG. And therefore, it is not a typical AV nodal reentry tachycardia. The supraventricular tachycardia starts with a normal PR interval. That is what is important to note. Okay, carry on.
Yes. This is the same surface ECG of the tachycardia initiation with the with an APC. Now, with two differentials in our mind, we have a number of maneuvers which we can use to differentiate AVRT and an AVNRT. First of them can be a ventricular overdrive pacing during a tachycardia. Ventricular overdrive pacing to measure the post-pacing interval and find the difference from the tachycardia cycle length, and also measure the difference between stimulus to A and a VA interval. This is based on the premise that an accessory pathway is necessarily close to an RV apical pacing site. So a pacing stimulus will first reach the accessory pathway before it reaches the node. So the pacing cycle length will more closely approximate the tachycardia cycle length in case the accessory pathway is the underlying mechanism for the tachycardia. We'll explain this in this tracing. This is ventricular overdrive pacing during tachycardia. There are some prerequisites for this maneuver. It should be performed during tachycardia, and it also requires that following the ventricular overdrive pacing, the tachycardia continues. And the pacing cycle length should be 10 to 20 milliseconds shorter than the tachycardia cycle length. This is the post-pacing interval. We can see the pace spikes here. This is the pace QRS, pace spike QRS, pace spike QRS. And this is the last pacing spike. The post-pacing interval is defined from the last pacing spike to the appearance of a native tachycardia QRS. And this is the tachycardia cycle length measured between two QRS complexes during tachycardia. So in our case, the post-pacing interval and the tachycardia cycle length were did not differ by more than 130 milliseconds, thus indicating the presence of an accessory pathway. As we already discussed, the accessory pathway is captured earlier by the apical ventricular pacing site, and that's why the PP post-pacing interval closely approximates the tachycardia cycle length.
Yeah, Anindya, this is an important concept, sometimes difficult to grasp just looking at the EGMs and this thing. It's a good idea to show a schematic diagram of what you're exactly doing and when you're stimulating and the stimulus going through the pathway and the entraining the tachycardia. So it's a little difficult concept.
Another entrainment we may leave here for so early in the teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a small comment by Anil Mahapatro. Atrial activation in CS is from ostium to CS12. So that's right. Can you just point it out that the major deflection in the CS catheter is the atrial electrogram, and a smaller deflection is ventricular electrogram. So activation of CS is from ostium to distal CS, proximal to distal.
This is the prominent A signals in the CS catheter, and this is the small V, which you can see.
Yeah. I think we should skip this. Aditya, what do you say? And move to the next one.
Please. Okay. Okay. Anindya, go to the next one. Anyway, I mean, just go forward, Anindya. So just keep on going. So please go back.
Previous slide.
So the final summary from this one was that the post-PPI and tachycardia cycle interval and the differences most closely approximated a pathway. That is the carry-home message. I think where people have written, we should have made some line diagrams. So maybe we'll fine-tune it next time when we do that.
Yeah.
Go next.
This is EP 1.0, not 1.5.
VOP, Dr. Mahapatra, Doctor, sorry about the abbreviation, ventricular overdrive pacing. Sorry about the abbreviation. VOP, Dr. Mahapatra, ventricular overdrive pacing during tachycardia.
Mummy, boys, come. Aditya, just one point, as you said, as Ajay said, I fully agree. This slide should not be discussed but just one point for the postgraduates, that a supraventricular tachycardia can be entrained by ventricular pacing. So this is a rapid ventricular pacing during supraventricular tachycardia. The atrial rate becomes equal to the pacing rate. So any supraventricular tachycardia, whether it is a AV nodal reentry, whether it is a AVRT, or whether it is a atrial tachycardia, all of them can be entrained by overdrive ventricular pacing. That's all that we should talk about on this slide at this point, in my opinion.
That's good. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Anindya.
Another way we can differentiate between an AVRT and an AVNRT is a His refractory VPB. A His refractory VPB is something, a ventricular premature beat, which finds the His refractory. It means the antegrade conduction has occurred over the VPB, over the His, when we deliver the premature ventricular complex. There are several ways we can get to know whether VPB is His refractory. First is the presence of a ventricular fusion complex. This is the tachycardia, and this is the pacing spike followed by a QRS. Although there is no comparison of another pace complex with this, we cannot say whether it's a fusion beat or not. There are several other ways we can decipher that a premature ventricular complex is His refractory. First, if the VPB is delivered prior to the anticipated time of appearance of the H wave, we can see the RF catheter was in the His, although H signals are not although His signals are not very easily deciphered, but we can see that probably this is the His signal, and before the next His signal could come, we have delivered the VPB. The importance of a His refractory VPB is that a His refractory VPB will affect only an accessory pathway mediated tachycardia. It will not affect an atrial tachycardia. It will not affect an AV nodal reentry tachycardia. There are several responses of His refractory VPB with an AVRT. In this case, there was atrial activation without a change in atrial activation sequence. We can see this is the tachycardia atrial cycle length. AA intervals are coming with the His refractory VPB. The retrograde impulse which has generated from the ventricle has found the His refractory, and it has gone has gone retrogradely through the accessory pathway and activated the atria, so that the A appears earlier than what it should have been had it conducted through the node. So this change in atrial activation sequence, this resetting of the atrial activation tells us that the accessory pathway is involved in tachycardia mechanism. We can also see that the His refractory VPB has also reset the VV interval. The V which should have the QRS should have come earlier, which should have come later, has appeared earlier. So it has reset both the atria and the ventricles, and thus
Ajay, please reword this manual.
Yeah, Anindya.
Ajay, can you please Ajay, can you please simplify this for the purpose of PGs?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an important concept that Anindya is talking about, and this is a very basic maneuver which is done in these supraventricular tachycardias. Now, since I don't have control of the screen, Anindya, can you bring your pointer to your RFD catheter and show the His electrogram? So I don't think that is the His electrogram. The His electrogram is the one small blip prior to that. Before that also. Yeah, probably that. That is probably the, is that the His electrogram, Aditya?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So during tachycardia, the activation will be from the atrium through the AV node, His, and then the ventricle. When we are giving a His refractory PVC, what that means is the His is already depolarized. Anindya is pointing out the His. So that has come on time during tachycardia. But the stimulation in the ventricle is given at that time. So when you stimulate the ventricle with this PVC, His is already refractory. The impulse will not go from the ventricle through the His to the atrium. It is not possible because it has already been depolarized. But the impulse has found its way back to the atrium. And since it has found a way back to the atrium when the His is refractory, that means there is another way by which the impulse has gone to the atrium. So what is the other way possible? It could be only an accessory pathway, an additional pathway through which it has gone. Now, an accessory pathway will conduct faster than AV node. The accessory pathway conduction is extremely rapid. AV nodal conduction retrograde is decremental. So the VA interval, that is the RP interval, which you see on the ECG, but the VA interval, Anindya, can you point out the VA interval during tachycardia? Whatever is the VA interval, we should actually have it in milliseconds. So during the first three complexes, the VA interval is certain amount, but when the PVC is given the VA interval will become, the AA interval will become shorter, because it has rapidly gone up the very rapidly conducting accessory pathway and activated the atrium. So it resets the tachycardia, it has advanced the atrium. And that shows that there is an additional pathway, a pathway additional to the retrograde AV node conduction, which allows his refractory PVC to be conducted to the atrium. Now, what that always also does is, since it has reached the atrium early, it will come down the AV node early, come to the next QRS early, and go up the accessory pathway. So it resets it speeds up the arrhythmia also. So in a form, it's a single beat entrainment. Not only has it reset the tachycardia, it's also advanced the atrium. Yash, you want to add something to that, or Ashish?
Sure, very well explained. I mean, this is the most important maneuver. VNRT and an AV re-entrant tachycardia. That's the reason that we do this. And it only gets confusing when you are distinguishing between a post-receptal pathway and the atrial activation sequence doesn't help you directly. Sure. I think we can take a couple of more minutes on this and wind the case presentation.
Okay, okay.
And you can show the important things if
yeah.
A couple of them.
So finally, we came to a diagnosis of an accessory pathway. We mapped the signals near the CS source and at our catheter location. At our catheter location, this is the V wave. This is the A wave. This A wave is earlier than CS 910, which indicates that we are even more closer to the pathway than CS 910. And then V and A are almost fused, which indicates that we are almost at the right location for an ablative procedure. This mapping usually depends on the direction of conduction through the accessory pathway. If there was a manifest pathway during sinus rhythm, we could have mapped it during sinus rhythm. But because there is no manifest pathway and the pathway is conducting retrogradely, we'll have to map it either during tachycardia or during ventricular pacing. So we did it during the tachycardia. We can see that the A waves are earlier. A waves in the mapping catheter are earlier than the CS 910, and the V and A waves are reasonably fused, and we can start ablating.
Okay, Anindya, again, just a couple of points here with Dr. Aditya Kapoor behind you. You have the wealth of his experience. But in these cases, a couple of more things need to be done. If you have got clean unipolar signals in your lab, it is good to have them. Secondly, there is an important maneuver, parahesian pacing, where you need to look at the retrograde activation, whether it's via the AV node or via the accessory pathway during V pacing prior to ablation. And then you can also double check post ablation. And third thing, there has to be a good reason to ablate during tachycardia, because once you ablate and the tachycardia terminates, if your catheter gets flung around or if it's not through a long sheath, it can be a challenge. With Dr. Kapoor being around, it will not be a problem, but for everybody else, it can be a challenge.
So, Anindya, how do you know that this termination during ablation is intentional and in the pathway versus it is incidental?
How does it terminate, Anindya? How does it terminate?
It terminates with a V.
Terminates in which direction? In the VA direction or AV direction?
In the AV direction.
The last bit on your surface ECG, the last QRS is probably a part of the tachycardia, right? Because the cycle length has remained the same.
Yes.
So you have a V and you don't have atrial signals from the CS to corroborate. So you are terminating in a retrograde direction, VA direction, and this is the direction which the pathway is using. So your termination is pretty intentional and not incidental. Yeah.
Anindya, that's an excellent point which Sir has made. Even Dr. RD has written. Just go back to the previous slide quickly. So if you see in the mapping catheter, you are obviously seeing two signals, and once it terminates, you are just seeing a one signal. So it terminates in the retrograde direction. Even if the CSS you see, there is no A in the CS. So that's a very good point. And Dr. Ashish also remember what he said, tachycardia mein jab ablate karte hain, it's a very fast tachycardia. So your catheter gets flung around. So you can do it more predictably during RV pacing for para.
Okay, sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it terminated with a V, no?
Yes.
Go ahead. Final dikhao.
So this is post ablation atrial pacing could not.
Just go to the next slide. Sorry, this is just this one.
This is atrial pacing post radiofrequency ablation, showing AV Venke in the later part of the screen. The number of V waves we can count QRS 1, 2, 3, and the number of and obviously the pacing spikes with the QRS with the A waves are more than the V waves. And this post RFA V pacing shows VA dissociation. It finds the node refractory and it cannot go up through the accessory pathway because the pathway has been ablated now, and therefore there is a dissociation when we pace the ventricle at a rate faster than the refractory period of the AV node. So this is an indirect indicator that we have successfully ablated the accessory pathway. This is the final ECG of the patient, surface ECG. And this is the catheter position.
I think you need to explain the view that it is. Where is the HIS catheter? Where is the CS catheter? Where is the ablation catheter? You need to explain it.
Yeah. Yes, sir. This is the LAO view showing.
What LAO? 20, 40, 80?
So LAO 45, sir.
That's right. Yeah.
Point out the structures.
Sorry, sir.
Point out the structures. Point out the triangle of Koch.
Yes. So this is the probably the CS os. This is the His bundle catheter, and this is
what is this?
This is this catheter is at His bundle probably.
Nahi yaar, kya keh? This is at the ablation catheter. His bundle is up there. His bundle to upar hai.
Sure. So that's quadripolar is the His bundle. That is your deflectable, which you're showing as ablation in the postroceptal region. Okay. And your decapolar is in the CS, right? Of the quadripolar catheter is the apex of your triangle of Koch, what His. Where the CS enters is the base of the triangle, CS os.
Please put the pointer on the His bundle.
So around here.
No. I think you're fishing in troubled waters.
अरे His bundle is up there ना Anindya, जो second catheter है, क्या confuse हो रहा है? Quadripolar.
Up, go right up.
Go right up.
That is the bundle of His.
Dr. Yash ने तुम्हें वहीं पकड़ा जहाँ पकड़ना चाहिए था.
Yeah, that's where the His bundle is.
And you are ablating below the level of the coronary sinus. That's where you are ablating. That is the ablation catheter. Now go back to the previous slide and show the VA block properly. Previous slide. For everybody's, this thing goes slow on this slide because not everybody is able to. When there are so many channels, I always find that people get confused. So always look only at one ECG channel and one intracardiac channel. So ECG channel can be V1, for example, and intracardiac can be CS78, for example. CS78 because the V wave is very small and what you're seeing are the A waves. So now clearly you can see there are very few A waves in CS78 and many more V waves on top, and there is many more QRS So obviously there is no relation between QRS and atrium, and this is AV dissociation. Now there is a suggestion from someone that the presentation by students will always not be perfect, but that is fine, because this whole exercise is for students who are little experienced to present, so that they get the confidence and others also get the confidence that yes, we as students can try to understand electrophysiology.
Because,
for others. That's good.
The very purpose is to make these presentations better every time. So, we'll...
Sure, that's great. So Ajay, I think we can move on.
Anindya, that was a good case and excellent beginning, and all the best for your thesis presentation today.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Dr. Ajay, Dr. Ashish, we can have the second presentation now. I think atrial fibrillation wala hai.
That's good. Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, I think
CB Pandey and Dr. Karthikeyan is there.
Yeah.
CB, go ahead, please.
Dr. Pandey has presented and I think got accepted a very good paper on this from the department. So that's why I wanted that he present some of his original experience and around the topic.
CB? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Yash, good to see you. Your video is on. CB, go ahead. CB, can you start your presentation?
Maybe on mute, maybe.
CB?
CB, unmute yourself.
Am I audible now?
Yeah,
yes.
Hello? Am I audible?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's the first part. Good morning, everyone. It's indeed a privilege to be present here today and among the solvers of electrophysiology that I've always idolized.
Dheeraj, let's mute everybody.
Hello.
Go ahead, CB. Go ahead.
CB, go ahead.
I was muted by mistake. Okay. My presentation today is on acute cardioversion of atrial fibrillation. It's a brief overview and attempt to go through the fundamentals of cardioversion in patients presenting with atrial fibrillation. So I'll start.
Sorry, CB, please stick to time also. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Yes. Atrial fibrillation is a supraventricular tachyarrhythmia with uncoordinated atrial activation and consequently an ineffective atrial contraction. So that is what atrial fibrillation is all about. How we classify atrial fibrillation? The first diagnosed case, which is not AF, which has not been diagnosed before, and this is irrespective of its duration or the presence or severity of AF-related symptoms. Then we have what is called paroxysmal AF, which terminates spontaneously without any intervention and with or without intervention and within 7 days of onset. Then we have something called persistent. An AF that persists beyond 7 days, so it is sustained beyond 7 days. It's called persistent AF, which is more difficult to treat. And then we have a long-standing AF. When an AF duration has extended beyond 12 months, and when the treating physician decides to adopt a rhythm control strategy, then we label it as a long-standing AF. A permanent AF is more of a management classification rather than a clinical classification. Any long-standing AF which the patient and the physician decides to accept it as it is and not to attempt any further restoration or to maintain sinus rhythm is labeled as permanent AF. Then we have another classification, which is there's something called clinical AF, which is an overt AF present symptomatically. We have AF showing on ECG more than 30 seconds of atrial fibrillation as per the ESC guidelines. That is labeled as clinical AF. The patient is symptomatic or asymptomatic, but is showing atrial fibrillation on the standard ECG. And then we have what is gaining more importance these days is atrial high rate activity, labeled as AHRE, and sometimes it is used synonymously with subclinical AF. these are events which are not, may or may not be present on the standard ECG when patient presents to the department, but these are patients who have CIEDs implanted, and these rhythms are picked up on the CIEDs, and this is a gray zone of atrial fibrillation as far as the treatment modalities go. So I'll be talking more about this later. So this was about the classification of AF. Now about the spectrum of presentation, a patient of AF can be either totally asymptomatic, which is called as silent AF, and of course that will be hemodynamically stable. And then we have symptomatic AF. Symptomatic AF can present with palpitation, dyspnea, fatigue, effort intolerance, or it can present sometimes the patient can be in a hemodynamically unstable condition, may present with a syncope, cardiogenic shock, ongoing myocardial ischemia. So that is it's also labeled in red here. It is clinically important. Hemodynamically unstable AF is an emergency. It's to be treated as an emergency. Then we have AF-related outcomes. You're starting off with death. Of course, death is the final and the most grave outcome. We have stroke. 20 to 30% of all ischemic strokes and 10% of all cryptogenic strokes can be attributed to underlying AF. Then the fast heart rate, if the heart rate is not controlled, this can long-standing tachycardias can lead to LV dysfunction and consequently heart failure. Then of course the cryptogenic strokes and irrespective of the stroke history can also present as a cognitive decline, vascular dementia, depression, and of course the impaired quality of life. This is seen in more than 60% of patients with AF. How do we approach AF? Like if we come across as a physician, as a treating physician, we come across a patient of atrial fibrillation. So this is a central dogma prescribed by the European Society of Cardiology, and this is how we approach a patient. This is the latest. This is what the latest guidelines say. The approach is from CC to ABC. So what do these terms stand for? CC is when a patient comes. First of all, of course, you have to confirm whether the patient is in AF, for which we need a 12-lead ECG set, and AF persisting for at least 30 seconds. After we have confirmed that the patient is in AF, we go on to characterize the AF, and this is done through the 4S AF scheme. 4S stands for, we assess the stroke risk, for which we most commonly use the Chadwick score, and then the symptom severity, for which we might use the EHRA symptom score, how severe the symptoms of the patient are, that will decide on the future course of management. And then we talk about something called the severity of AF burden. What is the duration, total duration, and whether the AF is able to terminate spontaneously or whether it needs some kind of intervention to terminate it every time. And then finally, we go on to assess the substrate severity, the underlying cause which has resulted in the patient developing AF in the first place. Most common, of course, being age and comorbidities and anatomical issues like atrial enlargement or fibrosis. So this is how we go from, this is the CC part of it, and then we go on to the ABC, which is the management. Now, once we have categorized the AF, we have placed the patient in a particular category, then we go on how to manage the patient. For that, moving on from CC to ABC, A stands for anticoagulation, avoiding stroke in a patient of AF, which can be a particularly debilitating condition. We have to identify the low risk patients, Chadwick score 0 or a female, and we have to decide whether the patient needs a long-term anticoagulation or not. Then from there, we move on to a better symptom control. A better symptom control will, of course, assess the patient's quality of life and what the patient himself prefers. Whether a rate control is reasonable enough to give him a good quality of life, or whether we need to go for a rhythm control strategy. Once we've done that, we move on to addressing the comorbidities, like I talked in the previous slide, and the cardiovascular risk factor management. This is called the integrated approach to management of AF. And of course,
it's come here. See this video.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes, very much. Please go ahead.
Okay. So although these ABC and CCA ABC are presented differently, I mean in sequence, But we must realize that all this has to go on simultaneously. The moment a patient presents, this should be our general approach in a patient of AF. Categorizing the AF and then moving on to the clinical management part. Since my topic particularly concerned with the cardioversion part, acute cardioversion, this is the most simplified version of definition of cardioversion I could get. I borrowed it from Wikipedia. It's a medical procedure by which an abnormally fast heart rate, it could be a tachycardia or any other cardiac arrhythmia, which is converted to a normal rhythm using electricity or drugs. This is the simplified version of what a cardioversion does in a patient of atrial fibrillation. A bit of the historical flashback. The first reports of pharmacological cardioversion date back to the late 1940s. There was a paper, in fact, which reported there was using quinidine, they were able to convert cardiovert 88.5% of the patients. And electrocardioversion using capacitor charged defibrillators made its way into the management protocol in the early 1960s. So that is how far the whole story of management of atrial fibrillation, the cardioversion goes. There are some points to ponder. Now we have talked about cardioversion, but we have to, before we go on to cardioverter patients, we need to address these issues. We need to ask ourselves these questions. First of all, is a need. Just because we can cardiovert, should we? And the timing of it all, should it be immediate? Like the patient, the moment a patient presents, we rush off and go on to defibrillate him, or maybe give him some medicines to cardiovert, or should it be a wait and see policy, wait and watch policy? And once we have finally made up our mind to cardiovert the patient, then we have to decide on the mode that we need to apply. Should we go for an electrocardioversion, or should we use a pharmacological approach? And then of course the more important aspects also are there. The need for assessment of the thromboembolic risk, pericardioversion thromboembolic risk, the need for the anticoagulation therapy, both pericardioversion and long term, and the use of post-procedural or long-term antiarrhythmic drugs. I'll be addressing each of these issues in the forthcoming slides. When should we go for a cardioversion? That is, this answers the first question of the need. Cardioversion is indicated more to improve symptoms and hemodynamic status of the patient. There is little or no evidence to show that it improves survival or decreases the long-term risk of thromboembolism. So it is, when we try to cardiovert a patient, we must keep in mind it should address the symptoms of the patient first of all. And it is also indicated for long-term rhythm control. Then in some patients of long-standing persistent AF, who have been doing pretty well on rate control strategy, but of late, if their ventricular rate has not been within the acceptable limits and the patient is going into heart failure or worsening cardiomyopathy, a decision of cardioverting the patient finally may be taken. Very infrequently, persistent episodes which do not respond to the fill-in-the-pocket approach may be taken up for cardioversion. The list of when not to is longer than when to. So when do we not cardiovert a patient? If a patient is totally asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic, we must remember that the first point was to treat the symptoms of the patient. So if the patient is asymptomatic, obviously cardioversion may not be undertaken. Then if the patient has multiple comorbidities, advanced age, poor overall prognosis, in these cases, the risk of doing a cardioversion procedure, of course, every procedure is fraught with risk, far outweigh the benefits. So it's not a very good idea to take such a patient for cardioversion. Then in a patient of having a low likelihood of maintaining sinus rhythm, like a patient presenting with a marked LA enlargement, significant MR, florid hyperthyroidism. These are the cases which will not respond, either not respond at all or will immediately recur. So they show poor results. So not a very good idea again to cardiovert such patients. Those patients who cannot receive anticoagulation. So with or without cardioversion, patients should be put on anticoagulation if the cardiovascular risk score dictates so. And if such a patient cannot receive anticoagulation, then of course cardioversion should not be attempted, because that itself will increase the risk of the patient for getting a stroke later on. If we see a LA thrombus, of course we have to watch. And then if there has been a thrombotic event, stroke or TIA, then we should not cardiovert the patient. The question here is how old? It's an open-ended question. I tried finding an answer. I could not. I hope the consultants will be able to answer this question. I was not able to find the answer to this. How long a thrombotic event should have happened before we decide not to cardiovert the patient? So, and then failed prior cardioversion, multiple cardioversions attempted, not successful, need not go for cardioversion again. AF has been continuously present for more than 1 year. This is one AF which is notoriously difficult to treat, will probably not respond again. And LA, that is, we have a patient with LA that is markedly enlarged, atrial dimensions measuring more than 6 centimeters, or a LAVI more than left atrial volume index measuring more than 48 ml per meter square. Don't go for cardioversion. If reference while taking adequate doses of appropriate antiarrhythmic drug therapy, even if we cardiovert these patients, very likely they'll fall again into the AF vicious circle, and not very rewarding to cardiovert such patients. And again, for the same reason, if the patient has failed more than one antiarrhythmic drug therapy, is less likely to maintain sinus rhythm with other drugs. So cardioversion need not be attempted in such patients. We talked about the timing. If patient comes, we jump and treat the patient, or do we wait and watch? This is a very burning question, which was, I believe, adequately answered by the RACE-7 AQUAS trial, which is the rate control versus the literature cardioversion trial. This study was conducted in around 15 hospitals in Netherlands. It was a multi-center trial, and what it went on to show was that a wait-and-see approach with an initial rate control and delayed cardioversion, only if needed, allowed almost 70% of the patients with recent onset AF to regain sinus rhythm spontaneously. With only 16% patients in which who spontaneously cardioverted, in which these were the patients, mind you, who presented to the emergency department. And the patients were, when taken up for immediate cardioversion, showed only 16% rate of spontaneous cardioversion. At 48 hours and 4 weeks after the index AF, the number of patients in both the categories was same, that is 90%. And also, the same story continued at 30 days, and up to 30% of the patients had a recurrence of self-terminating paroxysmal AF after the index cardioversion, which was also similar between the two groups. Essentially, both the groups had very similar outcomes. So what
can I interrupt for a second at this point?
Yes, sir.
Because this is an extremely important point that you have made, the wait and see approach. What I see here in Bombay, I don't know how is the situation in the rest of the country. The immediate reflex of everybody, whether it's in the private sector or even in the teaching hospitals, is to start intravenous amiodarone. And almost every week, I see unnecessary amiodarone producing highly unnecessary cellulitis. Amiodarone, first of all, is not the drug of choice for acute atrial fibrillation. And if you just give a beta blocker, sedate the patient, look for triggers, and wait and watch, there is no harm for 24 hours to just wait and watch. Because as you said, a majority of these and people say, we gave amiodarone, it reverted to sinus rhythm. Even if you're not given amiodarone, it would have come to sinus rhythm. I do not know when this mindset will go, but this is a situation that I see day in and day out.
Thank you, sir, for the insight. And yes, of course, the RACE trial also came up with the same conclusion that a wait-and-see approach should be the default approach, with default cardioversion only if deemed absolutely necessary. So this is what the inference was. So wait-and-see policy is better than immediate cardioversion, provided the patient is hemodynamically stable. What the guidelines say, the repetition is the same thing. If the patient is hemodynamically stable, we need to check the anticoagulation status, and then if the patient is, of course, hemodynamically unstable, we go straight for the cardioversion. In a stable patient, we check the OSC status and proceed with cardioversion as decided. And then we have to check the current AF status for duration. If it is more than 48 hours, if it is within 48 hours, then we can go for an early cardioversion, or we can wait for a delayed cardioversion. And if it is more than 48 hours of onset, then we need to anticoagulate the patient at least 3 weeks prior to the elective cardioversion and for 4 weeks after. This should be our approach as per the wait-and-see policy. When we move on to the acute cardioversion of AF, Acute cardioversion of AF generally refers to cardioversion in stable patients. Unstable, of course, we straight away take up for cardioversion. With recently diagnosed symptomatic AF that does not terminate spontaneously. This is my topic that I'm going to cover today. I've been covering, and now we move on to whether now once we have decided to cardiovert the patient, the big question arises whether it should be through electrocardioversion or it should be a pharmacological cardioversion. Now here we must note that ECV terminates up to 90% of AF and is a treatment of choice in severely hemodynamically compromised patients with the onset AF. And also the patient presenting with first-time AF, ECV is the treatment of choice. Pharmacological cardioversion, on the other hand, converts mostly recent onset or paroxysmal AF, which in principle is self-terminating, as Sir rightly pointed out, and which would convert AF to sinus rhythm in 50 to 70% of cases within a few hours. When we take the electrocardioversion approach, ECV approach, there are certain general considerations that must be kept in mind. Patients must be kept fasting for at least 6 hours. There must be hemodynamic monitoring, oxygen saturation, electrolytes, anticoagulation status should be reviewed. Digoxin need not be withheld unless digitalis toxicity is suspected in the patient. And it should be a synchronized ECV, synchronized to the QRS complex, and should be performed when the patient is under full under sedation, preferably, and having continuous hemodynamic monitoring. And of course, it should be done in a situation where airway equipment and airway expertise are present, just in case the patient collapses and you need to protect the airway arises. It is more effective when using a biphasic defibrillator compared to a monophasic one. Anteroposterior electrode position restores sinus rhythm better compared to anteroapical, which is the most common practice. Most of the physicians use an anteroapical approach. Anteroposterior approach is more efficacious. We should start with the maximum shock energy which is available in the defibrillator rather than going for escalating shock energy. And even in patients with an implantable pacemaker or ICD, damage to the system can be avoided by biphasic ECV in the apical position rather than anteroapical position. To use an anteroapical position with an implanted ICD, it might damage the system. So again, in this case also, an apical position is preferred. A possible new indication for diagnostic electrical cardioversion. In some patients with persistent AF, in which we have allowed the patient to be in AF, and the relationship of the patient with his AF is not clear. In such cases, a diagnostic ECV may be performed, and we can wait and watch to see whether the patient's symptoms are improving after the conversion to the sinus rhythm. If it is, then obviously it's an indicator that the AF was the culprit responsible for the patient, and then we can go for a long-term rhythm control strategy in such patients. So this is a possible new indication for ECV. What are the predictors of a successful ECV? Duration of AF. Long-standing AF, of course, are notorious to treat, do not respond very well. The more the age of the patient, the more difficult to treat the AF. The functional scars the patient presents with, and the pre-treatment with antiarrhythmics, whether the patient has received any antiarrhythmics prior to the attempted cardioversion. When we talked about antiarrhythmic drugs here, what is the role of, when you have decided to take an electrical approach, we still need antiarrhythmic drugs. What is the role of antiarrhythmic drugs here? First of all, they increase the likelihood of a successful cardioversion. Drugs like sotalol, ibutylide, dofetilide, they decrease the cardioversion energy requirement, and they're helpful in refractory patients. Secondly, they prevent recurrent episodes of AF soon after cardioversion. The recurrence prevention is also one role that these drugs play. And finally, if we have decided upon a patient to be followed up with a long-term AED, we might as well evaluate the tolerability of one or more of these drugs, which we plan for long-term control. So this is again one of the important roles for ECV. Is again presented in a tabular form. These drugs on the left side, they decrease the threshold for cardioversion, or they prevent the immediate recurrence of an atrial fibrillation. Those on the right prevent subacute recurrences. So, I'll not go into details. This is the table for these drugs, and recurrence is the most disturbing part of cardioversion. We are happy, we cardiovert a patient, we are happy the patient is in sinus rhythm, and immediately afterwards, or maybe a few hours later to a few days later, the patient comes back with an atrial fibrillation again. What is the timing of recurrence? The 1-1-1-1-1 rule, that's 5 times 1 rule, will give a good picture of the recurrence, when and how to expect the recurrence. Within the first minute, after a patient has been successfully cardioverted, this is the immediate recurrence of atrial fibrillation. So that's within 1 minute. Then after the patient has been stabilized, for 1 day after cardioversion, the patient remains in sinus rhythm. This is what we call the release gap. In this particular period, the atrium is stunned and it is not able to fibrillate. So this is the period between 1 minute to 1 day when the patient will remain in sinus rhythm. And then subacute recurrences occur within a week because of increased vulnerability, reverse remodeling of the atria, which leads to electrical dyssynchrony in the atria, and that leads to subacute recurrences. This occurs within a week. And then we have a long-term late recurrence, which occurs over a year. So this is the 1-1-1-1-1 rule for the timing of recurrence. Gives a good idea of when to expect a recurrence and what is the pathophysiology behind it. How do we minimize these recurrences? Applying a shock will increase the chance of reaching the relapse gap. Relapse gap may also be increased by anti-arrhythmic drugs, pre-treatment with anti-arrhythmic drugs, and also with intracellular calcium lowering agents like verapamil and beta blockers, as well as ARBs. Subacute recurrences can be prevented by all AEDs, but even better if controlled with an ARB or verapamil. Late recurrences respond well to AEDs, and once in a while, repeated ECVs might be given, which is called season ticket ECV. Finally, catheter ablation is the preferred option if recurrence risk is high. All procedures, however good, come fraught with risk, and ECV is no different. We have complications. We have sedation-related complications. We have patients going into hypertension. We have patients going into VS due to inappropriate shock synchronization, bradycardias. And in fact, bradycardias are frequently diagnostic. Like they might help to unmask a sick sinus, underlying sick sinus or sick AV node syndrome, which was lying undiagnosed. We have tachycardia, such as atrial flutter developing after cardioversion with a 1:1 conduction leading to sausage. And we have a cardiac biomarker release. We might observe transient elevations of tropi, CPK, MB, and even ST elevation. These are self-limiting and not too much of concern. Then we move on to pharmacological cardioversion. What the guidelines have to say for this? Pharmacological cardioversion is only indicated in the hemodynamically stable patient. If the patient is unstable, there is no role of pharmacological cardioversion at all. And then again, there is another group of patients presenting with sick sinus syndrome or having AV conduction abnormalities or prolonged QTC, in which the PCV should not be attempted at all. For all other conditions, PCV or PCV, one of the other modalities may be chosen, and the choice depends on the assessment of potential benefits and risk of choosing one over the other. What are the potential benefits of a PCV approach? We avoid the risk of sedation. We can also try a test for drug tolerance. I told you if the patient is planned for a long-term AD, it's a good idea to check for drug tolerance beforehand. So PCV, we might as well cardiovert the patient with a medical approach rather than an electrical one. Then disadvantages, they are related to the drug tolerance.
Dr. CB, Dr. Ashish has written, please wind up, just go to the, because we probably, can you go forward? Okay. Dr. Ashish has written.
Yeah. This was about
just try to wind up in the next 5-6 minutes.
Okay. RAF2 trial, which was about why pharmacological cardioversion is as good as an electrical cardioversion. These are the preferred drugs. For immediate cardioversion, flecainide, propafenone, vernaculant as the most effective. Amiodarone, sotalol, as Senate pointed out, they're not very good drugs. It's more for a rate control approach rather than in the initial hours of treatment. And as far as cardioversion goes, they are pretty ineffective. These are specific anti-arrhythmic drugs. I'll have to rush through them. Flecainide, I pointed out, is the most effective, 92% conversion rate within 6 hours. And propafenone comes to a close second. Dofetilide, not very effective. Vernaculant also sees a rapid cardioversion. Then these are other drugs. You have the pill in the pocket approach for which flecainide and propafenone are used. one thing to be kept in mind is if you're using a pill in the pocket approach, it's a good idea to give a rate control drug like a diltiazem or a beta blocker to prevent AF converting into atrial flutter with a 1:1 conduction. These are some factors which will influence a successful pharmacological cardioversion. And hemodynamic changes after reversion, there may be immediate changes, beneficial immediate benefit changes, or it might be a long-term changes. So this is related to remodeling of the atrial anatomy and the restoration of the sinus rhythm and rate control. All these factors jointly contribute to restoring the hemodynamic stability in the patient. And that is why rhythm control strategy is a good strategy. We talked about the thromboembolic risk. They need to be assessed prior to the cardioversion. We need to categorize the patient in which category he belongs. ECV, PCV carry the same thromboembolic risk, and AF or AFL, they carry the same risk. And the rates are much higher with patients not on anticoagulation, of course, compared to those on coagulation. This is a logical conclusion, and that is why patient needs to be anticoagulated. The OAC status needs to be checked, and a decision needs to be made whether the patient has to receive anticoagulation, long-term anticoagulation. There are some studies which show the beneficial effect of anticoagulation pericardioversion, and the thromboembolic events occurring in AF patients receiving anticoagulant therapy. There was trials like Rhythm AF registry, 0.51%, they're pretty low compared to patients who have not received the anticoagulation therapy. So the key points to be noted here: pericardioversion thromboembolic rates are between 1.1 to 2% in patients not or sufficiently anticoagulated. They both belong to the same category, insufficiently or not anticoagulated, and between 0.28 and 0.8% in patients are sufficiently anticoagulated. So there's a major difference. And the patients presenting with AF lasting for less than 48 hours, thromboembolic rate without anticoagulation is 0.7%, and it increases with the CHA2DS2-VASc score. It's a good idea to anticoagulate even patients presenting less than 48 hours. If we decide to cardiovert them immediately, it's always a good idea to try to anticoagulate this patient, either with heparin or one of the NOACs, which achieve sufficient anticoagulation prior to the cardioversion. Temporal incidence, most of the thromboembolic events occur within the first 10 days, and that is why the guidelines mention up to 4 days.
CB, I think you must be encroaching on the time. So what you can do is wind up with the two data set Dr. Yash has written. If you have some information about rheumatic atrial fibrillation, just wind up with those two data sets. Just wind up with that.
Rheumatic heart disease, lot of studies.
Just wind up after you've told these studies, and Dr. Karthikesan and Dr. Yash.
The CRAFT study was the one that was done in the RSG related AF, and it showed that the addition of amiodarone increased the success rate of 69%. And it was one of the first studies that was done in rheumatic atrial fibrillation. And then we have an in-house study done by our own Dr. Nandia, who was the presenter, the one before me. It was done at SGPJ under the guidance of Kapusat. And this also showed a successful maintenance of SR at 1 year, which is achieved at 60% with flecainide alone. So pharmacological cardioversion as an initial modality using flecainide is a good idea. It can be used, and this is what the study showed in rheumatic, even in patients presenting with rheumatic heart disease related valvular abnormalities.
So just show your final slide now. Final slide. So okay, other things the seniors can discuss.
PCV is the treatment of choice. PCV mainly converts. We have talked about this earlier. Less than 48 hours. Flecainide may be an attractive modality in treating patients with AF. Vanacalant is a new addition to this group of drugs, which can be used in treating RSD patients with AF. So in most patients with recent onset AF, wait and see policy is approached.
So but this just wind up now. So this is done. So I think we can
Dr. Pandey, it's a nice presentation. So I want you to highlight some of the practical points to the postgraduates. When you come across an unknown duration or more than 48 hours duration of atrial fibrillation, if you decided to cardiovert either electrically or pharmacologically, your pericardial anticoagulation protocol, will they differ, or you follow the same protocol? Because we see in practice, when they want to do electrically cardiovert, they go aggressive OTE and other things, anticoagulation. When they want, sometimes like Ash mentioned, they simply put the patient and start the amiodarone. They don't much bother about that anticoagulation. So what is your take on that?
For a patient presenting with AF duration of more than 48 hours and in a hemodynamically stable condition, and since you have decided to take on an elective approach, there are two possible pathways that can be taken. One is we can go for anticoagulation of 3 weeks prior and 4 weeks after, which is the standard protocol, and that is pericardioversion anticoagulation, and ensure that the sufficient anticoagulation has been achieved. The second pathway that we can use, which will cut short the time and save the patient the trouble of having a 3 weeks of prior anticoagulation, is to straight away go for a PE-guided cardioversion. And if we do not visualize the LS thrombus, then we can start the patient in anticoagulation straight away and go for a immediate cardioversion. And studies have shown, in fact, my previous slides, which I had to skip unfortunately, they have shown that PE-guided image cardioversion with sufficient anticoagulation is as good as and non-inferior to 3 weeks of waiting period and for anticoagulation. So either of these approaches can be used depending on the expertise of the hospital which is treating these AF patients and the ready availability of PE, and of course the operator expertise.
Yeah, even if you want to pharmacologically cardiovert, you want to try, so you want to give ibuprofen or something, so you want to do the TE or roll out, or you will wait for 3 weeks and then you would take the patient.
But there are no official guidelines on this. I think it's more of a personal preference, whether the treating physician wants to wait for 3 weeks. Of course, it's between the patient and the doctor, whether the patient feels it's okay to wait for 3 weeks. And so we go for prior anticoagulation for 3 weeks. Or if the doctor is not sure whether the patient will come back again to him and feels that the patient does need a rhythm control strategy, he is readily available. I think it's not a very bad idea to go for a PE-guided cardioversion with sufficient anticoagulation.
So, in your to re-emphasize on that, which are the patient you should you must try to establish the sinus rhythm. So even though you mentioned that it's mainly for the symptomatic benefit, even the less symptomatic or asymptomatic person for whom we should aim for sinus rhythm.
If the patient has a new onset AF, first episode, it's a good practice to try to establish rhythm control, because if it's a new onset and the patient, like say 3 months ago, he presented without an AF, the patient comes with a new onset AF, the chances of him not going into recurrence are pretty high for a new onset AF that without any comorbidity. So rhythm control strategy may be a good strategy in such patients.
Yeah. So
whereas on the other hand,
some of the patient correct. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. On the other hand, if we come across a patient with multiple comorbidities, like I mentioned, a large LA size and advanced stage, these patients, even if you go for a rhythm control strategy, they are very likely to go into recurrence, and it will not be very fruitful. The approach would not be very fruitful. So maybe we can go for a rate control strategy in such patients.
So young patients,
these are not very hard and fast rules. These are flexible rules, and they can be modulated according to the patient population we are taking.
Because we come across in practical things many times sufficient because they are less symptomatic, they've been left with the atrial fibrillation. So young patient, less comorbidity, normally less size or mild dilatation.
That is the population we would like to go for a rhythm control.
And hyperthyroidism treated now in euthyroid, but AF is not being reverted. So these are the patients one should aim for and make them to sinus rhythm.
I think with permission of Dr. Karthikeyan will try and move on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Aditya, can you lead the third presenter?
Marak, so the third presentation is Dr. Ashish had wanted something to be discussed about PVC cardiomyopathy. Marak, are you go there?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah, so try to keep to time here because I think the information is so vast, but you guys are doing a great job. So try to keep to time. PVC cardiomyopathy.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. It's indeed a privilege for me to present in this esteemed forum. Today, I'm going to briefly discuss regarding the enigma of PVC-induced cardiomyopathy. So, I'd like to I would like to cover under following headings: introduction, mechanisms, risk factors, diagnostic workup, management, finally the conclusion. So frequent PVC can cause an often reversible form of cardiomyopathy, and it was suspected to be a benign clinical course, but nowadays it has been described that it does cause decrease in the LV function and even in the absence of symptoms. So it is a diagnosis exclusion, and we do the working diagnosis is a presumptive diagnosis, and diagnosis is being confirmed in the setting of demonstration of a high PVC burden with LV systolic dysfunction and with upon normalization of the LV function after PVC elimination. So it can present in 3 clinical settings. First one is the classic idiopathic one, that is in the absence of any alternative etiology, and then it can present with low PVC burden. Thirdly, the patients can present with an already established cardiomyopathy like coronary artery disease. So coming to the mechanisms, there are several mechanistic explanations being postulated. The major ones are intraventricular dysynchrony, altered calcium homeostasis, intraventricular torsional changes, and tachycardia related. So just highlighting tachycardia related changes, one supposed to be the major mechanism, but nowadays tachycardia induced cardiomyopathy be considered as a separate entity. And it has been shown that in PVC induced cardiomyopathy, the average heart rate is being similar with the patients without cardiomyopathy with frequent PVC. So the major contributor as of now is intraventricular dysynchrony, and basically there are animal models which demonstrate some evidence in favor of this mechanistic explanation. In summary, in animal models, it has been shown that cardiomyopathy of fibrosis in animal models, whereas in humans, epicardial and the broader QRS complexes having the similar interpretation, but fibrosis is not described in PVC-induced cardiomyopathy in humans, and also it takes months to years for development of PVC-induced cardiomyopathy in humans. The molecular analysis suggests that the altered calcium homeostasis is a major mechanism, and it can be by alterations of calcium channel handling or impaired myocyte excitation contraction coupling by the following mentioned calcium channels. So the risk factors, there are several risk factors which have been described. Male, the longer duration together, and the PVC with longer QRS duration, then epicardial origin of the PVC, interpolated PVC, male gender, and lack of diurnal variation. So basically these factors have been based on cross-sectional data, and it has been shown that not all patients with these risk factors develop PVC-induced cardiomyopathy. So there is no definite cutoff for high PVC burden, and it has been shown that the estimate that is less than
Barak, your audio is
4% of PVC can also have LV dysfunction, where the reverse can also happen, may have a normal LV function. So when we can consider for a yes sir.
No, go ahead. Your audio was breaking. Go ahead.
Okay, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, when a single cutoff we can consider, by Bowman et al., it has been described that 24% we can take the single cutoff, and the average being 16 to 26%. And it has been emphasized that at least 10% burden is sufficient enough to warrant for regular follow-up. This is a scattergram by Bowman et al. Showing the 24% with a cutoff, and it has been a sensitivity and specificity of 80%. So then coming to the PVC duration and asymptomatic status, the symptomatic patients, that is symptomatic PVCs have a disproportionately high risk of development of PAC, and it has been shown that palpitation duration of less than 5 years is having a odds ratio of 4:1, whereas more than 5 years, 20 times more predisposing for development of PVC-induced cardiomyopathy, whereas in asymptomatic status, it is 2:1, but asymptomatic patients have a higher chance of prolonged exposure because of no attention of the medical advice. And it has been shown that PVC, the natural history, is quite notorious. In a minority of patients, it resolves, whereas in most of the patients, it remains as such if not treated. So QRS width of more than 150 millisecond is the best cutoff as a single value. And interpolated PVC has been described as having the PVC type, which is predisposed to PIC more often. And this is also another parameter of QRS ratio. That is ratio of the QRS width of the PVC upon ratio of the QRS width of the sinus generated one. If it is more than 1.9, is also an adverse marker. This is just an ECG strip showing the an interpolated PVC. So also male gender and diurnal variation, lack of diurnal variation also predisposed to distractors for development of PIC. Now focusing on the diagnostic workup. So we should focus on the nature and duration of the symptoms. So because there should be a temporal relationship between the PVC onset and cardiomyopathy onset. So a causal relationship from historical background we can establish. We should investigate for any signs of heart failure. We should identify any exacerbating or elevating factors, and there should be an initial evaluation for etiology of PVCs. So the bare minimum investigations apart from routine lab work should include ECG, echocardiography, coronary angiogram, and cardiac MRI. So ECG, the standard 12-lead ECG will be helpful for PVC localization, which ultimately will guide us for catheter ablation access and also for prognostication purposes. And Holter monitoring is helpful to evaluate the frequency of PVCs, number and nature of PVC morphologies, and the variation of the PVC burden throughout the day. And in echo, we should look for the chamber sizes as well as LV and RV ejection fraction. And ejection fraction is best determined by echocardiography when we compare to the other non-real-time imaging modalities. And for EF quantification, the sinus beat following the first post-extrasystolic beat should be used. And in case of constant bigeminy, averaging of the sinus and PVC beats to be taken up. And another recent modality, that is strain imaging, is also helpful and also more sensitive than a conventional echo to detect subtle LV dysfunction, specifically in the setting of low PVC burden. Then cardiac MRI is useful to identify any structural heart disease, because we know that PIC is a diagnostic exclusion. So we have to exclude any existence of the structural heart diseases. For example, if there is a late gadolinium enhancement on cardiac MRI, we can go ahead with PET scan to rule out any infiltrative or inflammatory cardiac disorders. It is also helpful for risk stratification by quantifying the scar burden, especially in the setting of RBBB PVCs or with pleomorphic PVC morphology. So coming to the management. So management, the goal is to eliminate or to at least to reduce PVCs to the larger extent. And it can be by medical management, catheter ablation or ICD. More often, we prefer for a combined approach. So complete elimination is not always possible. So we generally, the realistic goal should be reduction of the PVC burden to less than 5 to 10%. So coming to the medical management, should focus on the treatment of heart failure and treatment of any secondary causes like metabolic or electrolyte imbalances, behavioral management, that therapeutic lifestyle changes modification, and anti-arrhythmic drugs. So beta blockers and calcitonin blockers are the initial drugs which we generally use, but it is having a limited effectiveness of only 10 to 24%. And amongst the anti-arrhythmic agents, amiodarone is the most commonly used drug and shown to be a success rate of around 70%. And in a recent study, it has been shown that the mean EF increased from 27 to 49% with a good improvement of the functional class. And class 1C agents are often avoided in the setting of frequent PVCs in the light of negative trial, that is CAST trial, whereas recently flecainide has been evaluated in this context and shown a positive feedback. And dofetilide and sotalol are having limited data in this regard. So coming to the catheter ablation. So catheter ablation is having an average acute success rate of 85% in comparison to maximum efficacy of anti-arrhythmic drug, that is 70%. So what are the predictors of ablation success? The positive predictors are RVOT origin and a single PVC morphology. The negative predictors are pleomorphic PVCs and epicadal or papillary muscle origin. And unfortunately, these two, pleomorphism and origin of epicadium or papillary muscle, often coexist, leading to a less success rate of PVC ablation. But overall, catheter ablation is being preferred as the initial treatment consideration, although no RCT head-to-head between the medical arm and the catheter ablation arm being conducted so far. So these are the recent trials conducted to show the outcomes of the catheter ablation. The most robust amongst them is by the Lachmasetti et al. In 2015. It is showing that a mid to long-term successful ablation of 85% with catheter ablation along with antiarrhythmic drug and 71% without antiarrhythmic drug, only catheter ablation. And it is to be mentioned here that they have found that 67% had EF improvement more than 10%, whereas 18% less than 10%, and 15% did not experience any improvement in ejection fraction. That is the point of no return of EF. So in this regard, it was thought-provoking that whether we should approach for earlier and aggressive pattern for catheter ablation. So the favorable site for catheter ablation, as we know, is RVOT PVCs, which constitute 2/3 cases of the all PVC origin. And the standard protocol is by activation and pace mapping, being guided by fluoroscopy, electromagnetic mapping, and intracardiac echocardiography. So when we are having a failed RVOT ablations, before retrieving back, we should map pulmonary artery, coronary venous system, and aortic cusp, especially in the post-septal location of the RVOT foci. So these are the few challenging PVC foci, that epicadial PVCs, LV summit, intramural, papillary muscle, and paraegean. So epicadial PVC can be accessed via coronary venous system, endocardial, or epicadial, depending upon the exact localization of the PVC. And the crux is that epicadial PVC, despite all our effort, it is having a low success rate. And LV summit, shown in this diagram, this is the LAD and LCX, that bifurcation, basically the LV summit, and the anterior-intraventricular vein is being present there. We have to properly map, and we have to go through this anterior-intraventricular vein to ablate the LV summit PVC foci, although it is challenging because of the proximity of the coronary arteries. And intramural PVCs, and it is often diagnosed retrospectively after ablation failure, and several energy sources, as mentioned here, can be used. So papillary muscle PVCs and paraegean PVCs, basically the energy source we generally use for this is cryoablation. So the complications rate is very low. It's 2.4 for the major complications. The most common being, as usual, is vascular access related. The second one is the pericardial tamponade, and amongst other, AV block, damage to coronary arteries, and neurologic complications. So coming to the reversal of cardiomyopathy, which is very important to discuss here, and it is challenging because we have assumed the diagnosis of the PAC to be presumptive, whereas we can assess as per the predictors, the negative predictors of the reversibility, late gadolinium enhancement, QRS width, more QRS width, and pre-existing cardiomyopathy and diffuse scarring. Whereas the positive predictor is a greater post-systolic accentuation on the beats following PVCs. It indicates the patient is having good cardiac reserve. So the most notorious amongst all the predictors is the PVC QRS duration for the lack of recovery. And there is a concept of reverse paradox. That means if we ablate a patient with a presumptive diagnosis of PVC-induced cardiomyopathy, even if we fail for ablation, but in long term, there is a reverse remodeling. So it retrospectively says that there is an underlying reversible cardiomyopathy. So similarly, in the setting of ischemic cardiomyopathy with frequent PVCs, if you ablate, then it has been shown to be having a significant improvement in the LVEF, and it has to be suspected if there is a limited scare in cardiac MRI scan in the setting of severe LV impairment. So what the guidelines say? 2015 ESC guidelines say that RVOT PVCs as a class 1 indication for catheter ablation whereas LVOT PBC should be considered only after failed antiarrhythmic drug regimen, is class 2B indication. And 2017 guidelines recommend it is class 1 if there is a suspicion of the PBC-induced cardiomyopathy with being failed therapy with antiarrhythmic drug, or antiarrhythmic drug is not tolerated, or if it is not the patient's preference. Now coming to the role of ICDs in PBC-induced cardiomyopathy, generally we follow the non-ischemic cardiomyopathy criteria, but should we advocate a wait and watch policy for ICD implantation? The rationality behind is that for ablating PBCs preemptively in anticipation for an improved ejection fraction in the setting of PIC, so that EF can be improved, so that we can avoid implantation of an ICD. But how long to wait for ICD consideration after ablation is not clear so far. But preemptively, we can consider for ICD implantation by inducing VT by program stimulation and cardiac MRI defining high scar burden. And whenever possible, in the setting of suspected PBC-induced cardiomyopathy, we should opt for implantation of a subcutaneous ICD because there is no requirement of pacing and there is a chance of improvement of ejection fraction. So this is basically not our topic, but this is a predecessor, that is management of frequent PBCs without cardiomyopathy. But the decision is also dicey here. Medical management is reasonable as initial strategy, and the risk of catheter ablation versus risk of development of the cardiomyopathy should be assessed side by side. And it has been shown that more than 1/3 of patients with PBC burdens more than 10% may go on to develop a cardiomyopathy. But when to switch over to catheter ablation is not clear so far. But we should, in this category of patients, which is really the gray zone, in this category of patients, the frequent symptom assessment should be done, and regular periodic follow-up LV function by echocardiography and PBC burden by Holter monitoring should be done. So finally, the challenges, enigmas which we face in the PBC-induced cardiomyopathy, understanding the coexistence of PBC-induced cardiomyopathy with other forms of cardiomyopathy, whether there is an associated risk of sudden cardiac death in PBC-induced cardiomyopathy, understanding why some patients with frequent PBCs develop cardiomyopathy and others do not, and defining an exact PBC burden that places patients at risk of developing cardiomyopathy. These questions are still unanswered in the setting of PIC. So finally, to summarize, we have to diagnose the patient promptly by proper clinical assessment and ECG, echo, and ECG, Holter, and echocardiography, and with additional complementary tests upon mandatory, that is MRI, coronary angiogram. And then promptly we have to intervene either medically or by catheter ablation. Finally, we have to follow up the patient with Holter monitoring and echocardiography. Specifically, if we have intervened, then at least we have to wait for 3 months for recovery to occur. Then 3 to 12 months follow-up is essential if we are intervening. So finally, to conclude, PBC-induced cardiomyopathy is often treatable and reversible. Pathophysiology in humans remains incomplete, and the goal should be a reduction or elimination of PBC burden, and catheter ablation significantly improve or normalize their ejection fraction. So finally, I would like to highlight the messages we should I should highlight here is PBC-induced cardiomyopathy is often a presumptive diagnosis, and it requires a high index of suspicion. And to understand the relevant investigation modalities we should do in a patient with the suspicion of PBC-induced cardiomyopathy, and we should keep in our mind that there is a good chance of recovery of LV function, especially once treated timely by catheter ablation. Thank you.
Thanks, Marak. That was a very good summary of the topic. You've covered everything. PVCs are such an issue. It's a wide spectrum. Some patients are having few PVCs and extremely symptomatic. Yes. On the other end of the spectrum is patients are completely asymptomatic with very frequent PVCs and onset of LV dysfunction also. So it's a little difficult to manage. But you've given a good overview of the thing. Probably it's important to have a good institutional registry of all these patients. So you're able to follow them properly down the line, longitudinal follow-up. So you're able to pick up the patients at the right time and intervene at the right time whenever required before they are too far gone. I wonder if you, there was a recent publication in Heart Rhythm by Mel Scheinman's group. It's called ABC VT. Can I share my screen? I think that is very, very good paper, and it has just one table. Can I share it? Could you unshare your screen?
Yeah.
Smarak, could you unshare your
screen? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You can share now.
Yeah, here it's coming up. So there is just one table which gives some additional information regarding what you've told also. When you look at this, can everybody see this table? It's you look at, this is the ABC VT score. Superior access 1 point, burden of PVCs 10 to 20%, give 2 points. More than 20%, 3 points. Coupling interval, if more than 500 milliseconds, these are late PVCs, 4 points. And VT more than 3 beats, it's 4 points. So when you look at this score, and you can see patients with 0 to 4 score, the event rate is very low. And when it's between 5 to 8, the events start diverging after a couple of years. And with a score between 9 to 12, they have a much more event rate. So this is an excellent paper by Mel Scheinman's group, which I think everybody should read, and it, they've taken care of it very well. Dr. Yash, Dr. Ashish, any comments on the topic?
No, surely. I mean, Yash, do you want to say? Yeah, one interesting thing that recently was added in one of the presentations was that if you have a couplet happening, then look at the morphology of the second couplet. And there Sam introduced this concept that if the second couplet tends to have a different morphology, or the second beat of the couplet has a different morphology than the first beat, then maybe we are facing a wave break of that PVC, and maybe these patients could deteriorate into a VF more easily than if both the beats of the couplet are of the same morphology. Yeah. No, it's interesting. I think none of these factors individually have managed to tell us who is more prone to cardiomyopathy. So as Ajay says, that you should longitudinally follow up them till you're convinced that either they have the symptoms or the symptom burden or a tendency to go to a non-sustained or a sustained VT or a cardiomyopathy setting in. That's when you would intervene in these patients. The outflow tract PVCs are obviously the most common. But you should not bring them to the lab so easily, because an outflow tract ablation is, you face a risk of, the RV outflow tract free wall is a pretty thin structure. So as long as you're ablating on the septum, you're safe. But the moment you are somewhere close to the free RVOT wall, then you risk the perforation or a pericardial effusion, and you wouldn't like to have complications in minimally symptomatic or asymptomatic patients. So you should have a strong indication to bring these patients to the lab. Pleomorphism, obviously, just a point. Pleomorphism probably would make you investigate more in terms of structural heart disease, predominantly in MRI. So the risk of pleomorphic kind of thing. Yeah, Ajay.
So another important concept of the interpolated PVCs, we often used to ignore them over years, but now it's recognized probably they contribute to PIC more than any type of other type of PVCs. And generally the VA block at 500 milliseconds explain the interpolated PVCs. And that is probably going to contribute to PIC more than anything else.
So Aditya, your winding comments, please.
Yeah.
Hi, Ashish. So
Hi.
I think
yeah.
I think it was a great session, and thank you, Ashish. Thank you, Dr. Yash, Ajay, Karthikeyan, all the people who have logged in. It was a great opportunity for our department as well. So I'm sure we'll sort of get these small glitches which were there in our presentation. We'll smoothen them out as we go along. And thank you, guys, our residents, who despite being in COVID duty, they volunteered as soon as I told them that this is there. So the best part was the enthusiasm which they all generated. So it is a very good thing for our country as a whole that these young guys are interested in arrhythmias. So
sure. I think the phones have started ringing. We have reached the end of the hour. We will do this certainly once a month with varied faculty, with great departments from the country. And I would like that more and more of the postgraduates join, and that will actually determine the fruitfulness of this activity. Thank you very much. And I would soon announce on the group to your head of the departments or program directors as to which department and what topics will be presented on the first week of the next Sunday. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining in, and have a great Sunday.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
bye-bye.
you.
Thank you so
Excellent
much.
presentations, everybody.
Thank you. Good presentation. Thank you for all.